Thanks, Aurelio. Thanks for inviting me to this seminar. My name is Sergi Valverde. I work in the Complex System Lab, which is part of a nice building, the PRBB. Maybe you know. Actually, I know that some of you know because my colleagues working there. And I'm a computer scientist, and I also hold a PhD in applied physics. And then I'm working somehow in between different fields, and between computer science, evolutionary biology, and also statistical physics. And my goal, trying to wrap everything in just one sentence, is try to make a theory of technological evolution, right? So what I'm going to present here is somehow a sketch of the things I have been doing in the last, let's say, 12 years, trying to go towards this grand goal of creating a theory of technological evolution. So the talk will consist on three different parts, called communication, computation, evolution, which somehow I think that the three components required for creating this new theory, which is strongly based on ideas from complexity and complex networks. And so in order to start talking about that, I would like you to imagine that there has been a natural catastrophe, and let's say because there was a war or there was an epidemic that wiped out all humankind from the earth, which is something that happened in a movie, and this is a frame from the movie. I was asking if people here knew about that movie. Yes, okay. How many people know about this movie? Okay, so I'm not going to tell what this frame is all about, because it would be a very big spoiler, so I'm not going to talk about that. Those of you who haven't seen the movie, I strongly recommend you to watch it. Planet of the Apes. It's a very old movie with Charlton Heston. In the beginning of the movie, Charlton Heston is smoking a cigar in a spaceship, which is completely off standards. And several things happen. And then one of the parts of the story is that humankind has been erased from the surface of the earth. So the question is, once we humans are gone, what species will replace us? And then there are several people will say different things. Imagine that some other species replace us eventually. And then the second question will be, what does it take in order to intelligence appear again on Earth? So again, that's a question that is open to multiple interpretations. But if the study of our history is of some value to try to answer that question, I would say that technology will be a very important part of the emergence of intelligence. Right? So that's why, for example, it would be useful to know something more about the evolution of technology. We can figure out what will happen in these scenarios like the one I was proposing. So there are many different facets of evolution, and here, what I have been doing is to make parallels between technology, the evolution of technology, and the evolution of the real evolution, biological evolution. And actually there are many parallels. I will try to make some of these parallels explicit so I can tell you more about that. And the take-home message from this lecture will be, we will focus on one thing, which is in the role of self-organization in the emergence of intelligence and in the evolution of technology. And I will try to convince you that self-organization is a very powerful force, both in nature and also in man-made artifacts. So And as you can imagine, let's start first of all, communication. Culture will be an important part of this theory, and we have strong evidence that culture and language have been one of the main drivers of intelligence, and also one of the main components of progress, of technological progress. And the communication is a basic need in humans, and networks are the tools that promote communication. So the network will be one of the main objects of a study here, and we will try to assess our theories through the study of networks, right? To try to quantify properties of networks, and also to try to make models, predictive models of these networks. So anthropologists and social scientists have been using networks for a long time. And the idea is that you can construct these mathematical objects that reflect interactions between elements. In this case, the elements will be persons, and the interactions will be, for example, family relationships. Of course, these social networks are not restricted just to family, but also to extend to friendship. And those of you who don't have friends won't understand what I'm going to do here now. And then when you take into account to extend these interactions, the network gets larger and larger, and then patterns start to appear, right? Like dense groups of connections, right? And also we have things like transitivity, which is this idea that a friend of you is my friend as well, right? And this property translates into the emergence of triangles, right, in the social network. And then we'll have things like some special links called bridges, which are those connections that are more weak in the sense of the social interaction, but that nonetheless are very important in order to bring all the system together. So for example, I belong to a different community, many of you belong to the community here, and I have a weak interaction with some of you, and that big interaction enabled me to be here today giving you a presentation, right? So these weak interactions are very important in order to bring together the system. So provided the right environment, environmental conditions and resources, these networks can get larger and can span, a whole city, for example, right? So the question is, what kind of patterns do you expect to observe at the larger scale? Before moving into that question, I would like to tell you a little bit more about network measures, which is something I'm going to use in the rest of the talk. The first measure is the degree, which is the simplest metric, which is the number of connections that each node has. This is a local measure, we see it's very important. The other is a non-local measure, which is the path length. It is the number of links required in order to navigate from one node to another node, which may be in the neighborhood or not, right? And this is very important because you will see real networks have some specific properties regarding the average length of these paths. Then we have the clustering coefficient, which is a measure of how dense are the interactions in your neighborhood. It's how well connected are your neighbors, which in social networks this is what happens, right? So because of transitivity. And finally, all these measures refer to undirected networks, but in many systems, what we have is directed links. I mean, we have asymmetric connections. So, for example, this represents a flow of information. In order to get a better idea of this, imagine when you send an email to someone, the direction goes in that way, and not necessarily the other. If the other person is polite, she will answer you back, right? So, but sometimes this is not the case. So, in principle, we keep the connection directed. So, patterns. Now that we know with this.
Don't you use kind of these network measurements like to compute the small wall topology?
Yeah, I'm going to present this. So I have presented the basic blocks, and then I will very quickly go into this. The small wall is, yeah, you're right. Oscar is one of the most recurrent and common patterns of in social networks. Before going into that, I would like to talk a little bit more about a property of networks called robustness, which is very important. For example, in terms of infrastructures, right? And here I have the two examples of that. And robustness refers to the ability of the systems to be connected, because as you can imagine, a system that is not connected is not functional. It's of no use. What we want is a system, and the system involves somehow and many elements interconnected, connected between them, so you can exchange energy or information, for example. So here there are two examples of that. One is the city, yeah, right? This means the city of a street or road networks. And obviously have to be connected, but here connectivity is not completely, the system is not completely dependent on that, because in principle this is land, so you can walk to any point in the space. No matter if there is a street or a road, in principle you can go, even if there are some hills or whatever. On the other hand, in man-made systems like this, like a computer or an electronic circuit, these systems are much more fragile. And normally, if you remove, usually you remove a piece of the circuitry, like let's say I take this chip off, what happens is often disaster, right? So, as you can see here, connectivity doesn't have to be the same. The impact of connectivity can have different consequences in different systems. But in general, what we want is to keep the system connected. And then, in order to get a better idea of what we're talking, there is a very nice and interesting model, which is this. It's link percolation. And it seems that random graphs, and in general many graphs, have this so-called percolation transition, which refers to a sudden change in the connectivity of the system. So, for example, in order to fix ideas, let's consider this model. Imagine this is a water pipe network. And everything here is a pipe that can be open or closed. So what we want is to transfer water. Everything here is a source of water. I want to connect this, to bring this water here. What do we need? We need to create a path, right? A path that connects this to this. And what I'm going to show you is that the emergence of the path takes place in a sudden transition, which is called the percolation transition. So imagine that I can open or close with a pipe with probability P, and then I vary P from 0 to 1, right? And that's the range. And here I'm going to plot the fraction of people that is connected. So for low values of P, and we start to open people at random, and then in yellow means the links that are transferring water. And for intermediate values of P, for very small values, we are not able to reach the other side. If we keep opening pipes at random, what happens is that some intermediate value it can be calculated, although mathematics are very complicated, which is, in the case of the lattice, is 1/2, we observe the sudden emergence of a path, and that connects the left and the right side of the lattice. And at this point, we say that the system is percolating, right? If we keep doing that, we keep opening more tubes, we end up with a system that is fully connected, and obviously it flows water. So that's one of the interesting properties of many networks, is that this transition between a system that is disconnected to a system that is fully connected, it doesn't happen in a linear way. It happens in a sharp, sudden transition. And that's a very interesting properties, because in many systems, complex systems, what we do observe is that the transitions from one state to the other are very sudden. And we have been doing this in this direction, but we can do it the other way. We can, for example, we can make the same model, and the standard condition is fully connected, and then remove pipes and see what will be the probability that the system is disconnected. So the same model predicts the emergence of a sudden component, a functional component, and the same model in the other way predicts that the probability to collapse is also a nonlinear property of the system. So that I think is a powerful message when you're thinking about issues of sustainability and also of collapse of societies. It often happens in a very sharp way. So as an application of this theory, to make this, when I was doing my postdoc in Toulouse, I was studying these objects, which are fascinating, which are, I don't know if you know this, have you seen any of those in Guinea? These are a termite nest built in Africa, and these are very spectacular examples of social nest architectures. And some people have been using that as an inspiration to build more sustainable buildings. It's quite unfortunate that there is not a lot of funds in that area, and in 90%, well, what I'm telling you, right? But in particular in this area, many of the funds go to pest control, that is to find ways to kill the beast, instead of trying to learn more things about this, which is quite unfortunate under my opinion, because many things we can learn from this. So what I did is was trying to assess the internal structure of galleries, because within these things there is a complex structure of network, and this network has very interesting properties. So in spite of these termites being completely stupid, like, I don't know if you have any experience with ants in the wood or whatever. I'm sure you have. And if you look at these individuals, are very random, right? They're very like not behaving with following any order. So in spite of these elements being not very intelligent, they are able to build these structures. And when you make the right model, which involves studying percolation in a lattice like that, I'm not going to enter into the details, you can also generate the prediction of the percolation transition for that. And interestingly, many of the real systems are close to the percolation transition. That means that these termites were able, in a self-organized manner, to build a system that is very close to a very efficient regime, which is keep the system connected, but at very low cost. And cost here means the effort in digging the galleries and also in transporting the required materials to build this thing. There was an exception. One of the nests we were analyzing was very far from the percolation transition. Why is that? Because it wasn't functional. This corresponds to a young nest that was abandoned by the colony. And that suggests a very interesting pattern of development. Perhaps these systems are built in a way that it starts from a very dense, random structure, and they are refined in a process until the optimal is reached. Unfortunately, we don't have more data about that, so we can, this thing I'm telling you is in a hypothesis. I hope in the future we can investigate more of this. But that's, sorry?
Curiosity, I mean, how do you obtain this structure?
That's a very nice story. So there was a guy called Grasset, a French entomologist, that in the 60s, last century, he went to Guinea and he was collecting these things. And these things are now in the National History Museum in Paris. They were gathering dust in some dark room. So my former advisor is here, Guiter Olas, went there. I had this crazy idea of trying to scan these things using medical equipment.
So it's with scanning?
Yes, with X-rays. Yes.
With X-rays.
Yeah. The problem is that we still don't have, we actually need field studies. We have to go there and observe the evolution of these things on the field. It's complicated because you have to bring X-ray machinery. Everything is a complex logistic problem. So the other transition, that's when the first transition, very briefly, the percolation transition. There are more transitions in networks. The other transition is the small world property that Oscar was talking about. And that refers to the fact that many of these systems, in spite of being in the space and to have very large average distance, I imagine that this corresponds to a large city, so traveling from here to here takes a little time, right? These systems are what exhibit this small world property. That means that in spite of being a very large system, the average length connecting any pair of nodes is very small. How this system achieves this? So here I have a sort of graphical motivation for the explanation, but I also have an historical experiment. And the mechanism that allows the small world in real social networks and in this system was exactly the same, is that shortcuts, that is links between distant parts of the system, a few shortcuts can bring the system together. And this example corresponds to the first transatlantic telegraph cable that was laid in the 19th century between Manchester and New York. And for the very first time, it was a very hard task to do it, but for the very first time, they were able to connect these two continents. The world was already connected in the 19th century. The problem was that the news traveled very slow, so if something happened in India, the news from that part of the world reached London, for example, 1 month later. So it wasn't like today, right? That something happens and you Twitter and it's almost instantaneously in the system. So that link, that telegraph enabled faster communication. And in a way, the telegraph was making the world smaller. So if you do the same experiment and you introduce one of these shortcuts, the effect of the shortcut is to bring together parts of the system. And we all know people that has been friends of us that have been traveling to other cities. So these connections, these social connections, are making the world smaller because information can travel through these shortcuts and can reach very distant regions in space. So the small world is something between a geographical network, which is very large, and a random network, which has a very short diameter. And you can perform experiments like, for example, measuring how fast information or disease spreads in the system. And this is another example. So you can make a very simple model and compute how many steps are needed in order to infect a geographical network or a small network, which is the same network, but with only 10% of the links required. And the results are very dramatic. So this, for example, corresponds to the propagation of information in the lattice. And then the same process in the small world is much faster, right? Just by running a fraction of lengths. So that's another sudden change in the properties of the system. The first was the connectivity, the emergence of a strong component, connectivity component, and the second is the propagation of information. They can exploit very effectively the pattern of connections in the system. And obviously, this will be the third pattern that we observe. Real systems are not just small worlds, but they are also what they are called scale-free networks, and this corresponds to the internet. It's a map of the connections between physical routers. And it's a very interesting map because it's very organic, and actually it's not very far from maps of genetic regulatory networks and metabolic networks. And here, not only shortcuts, but hubs, so these nodes that have a lot of connections, they can act as connectors between different parts of the systems, and so the small world in the scale-free networks many times is achieved not only just by shortcuts, but also by hubs. How this structure is obtained? So it seems that, and here I was comparing the scale-free and the random. I'm not going to deal about that because we don't have time. So it seems that a very simple self-organized process can yield these scale-free networks. And the idea here is, well, what you and Simon in the 60s called the rich gets richer effect. Now today is, for people that work in the field, is also known as preferential attachment, meaning that highly connected nodes, in virtue of this number of connections, their richness somehow, they attract more connections, they are more attractive. And if you do this process, you simulate this process, you end up with a network which is scale-free and also reproduces the heterogeneity of connections. So that will correspond with like a very short crash course on networks. And now we're going to use all this material to investigate a little bit more about technology. So first of all, what can you do with an heterogeneous architecture? I have tried to motivate the use of scale-free networks in order to allow better connectivity and faster transmission of information. What will be an ideal system exploiting those capacities? The brain. And the brain has a very peculiar architecture that people is trying to uncover, and people in this faculty, as Gustavo Deco, for example, that published a very nice paper, I think last week, have been investigating this issue, or they're investigating this issue very actively. And it seems that an interplay between the architecture of the brain and the functional processes, they give rise to consciousness and to what we call mind. This is still a very hard question. I would say that it's an open question, obviously, and I would say it's one of the hardest questions that we have ever tackled in the history of science. And for the same reason, I think that it's very important that we address that particular question. The brain is perhaps, I would say, it's perhaps the most complex object that we know of in the universe. And it's obviously the engine of innovation. So we want to know something about how technology develops. We better understand this, how this thing works. So my humble contribution to that is, okay, I don't know a lot of neuroscience, why we don't reverse engineering the rules that creative people is using every day to create novelty and to innovate. And this has been done in the past, in anthropological studies and so on. But in the last century, we have a very nice example. I think one of the most fascinating examples that we can look at, which is software. And software can be easily the most complex technology that humans will have ever designed, and is obviously a mystery. Although many people is developing software, but as you may know, developing software is not the same as understanding how software works, right? So I have been trying to learn something about the way programmers develop things, and there are two main approaches here. One is open source, and the other is closed source. And the open source will be more related to what software was all about in the 80s. So that is also from a movie. Do you know what movie is? War Games. War Games? More? Anyone more? Anyone that is not Grey Bird? No? Okay. So I recommend this movie to my students as well. So in case you haven't watched it, I recommend that you take a look, especially because last week were people arguing that there was a computer that has become intelligent, that has passed the Turing test and so on. That's a machine, this machine that this guy is playing with, this also passed the Turing test somehow, for reasons that when you watch the movie, you see why. So hackers in the beginning were people trying to share information. There was a community, it's like an open software community. They value innovation, and they are not very much worried about secrets, but about sharing information. It was an open culture, right? And then from the 70s, 80s, we moved from this group of people to something like that, right? Which is companies, right? The evil. Companies like Microsoft. And here the approach is completely different. Software is not anymore open, is closed, and actually is sold as a commodity, right? So they are selling you the right to use their products, or in case of Microsoft, the right to watch at a blue screen, which is what happens many of the time. And then, okay, how different are these systems? Is there any system that is better than the other? What do you think? What is much better? Open software, closed software?
Open software.
Open software. Any proponent of IBM and Microsoft and so on? I don't know, more robust, easier to develop, more functional, I don't know.
It depends on the team.
Depends on the team, right? Depends, that's good, that's a good point. It depends on the organization, right? Let's see, okay? I will try to provide some answer to that. So, what can you do? You can speculate, and we also have, anyone has her own ideas of what is best, but we can also measure things. So for example, with software, in particular in open source projects, there is a very rich data set. So I don't know if you are familiar with software development, probably you are, and many large projects use CVS servers, meaning that they keep track of every single change in the system. And by looking at these servers, you can reconstruct the whole history of development. And this is a very nice visualization. It's a free tool. You can obtain that, and then you can use this with whatever, with one of your favorite projects, and you get a very nice view, like say the development of Mozilla in 4 minutes and things like that, and it's very nice, very cool. And the original video comes with some disco music, and which is very nice to see. If you happen to like disco music, which I don't, but if you like it, it's good. So we have data, so we can test it. So one of the things you can do is try to make the invisible visible. Software is commonly used, every one of us is using it every day, but the problem is that it's a very unknown technology because you don't see software. What do you see is the execution, the result, the interface. But you don't see software because software is within the memory of the computer. It's you cannot touch software. So what we do, how do we measure that? One thing you can do is, do it in the past, but not in a systematic way as we did, is to try to make a representation of the logical structure of software. And complex software consists of many different pieces that are interacting. For example, subroutines that call other subroutines, or in more in object-oriented parlance, which is more modern programming, you have classes, and classes interact and use other classes and whatever. And it's very interesting because the architecture, the logical architecture of software systems displays a very strong invariant, which is independent of the function and the team and the conditions of development. It's independent of many things, and it's quite robust. Is that these networks are complex networks, they are scale-free, and they have a degree distribution which is very close to power law with exponent 2.5. Why is that? We did a model, and we have learned that a very simple model of growing the network by duplication, which mimics the usual tinkering process of someone who is developing software, reusing parts of the code, copying here and there, making adaptations. This simple process can obtain this structure. So I think that by just, it's a small contribution, right, but by measuring the structure of software and by making models, we have now learned and we have measured the extent of tinkering and duplication during the process.
Can you say what this exactly represents, this network?
This network is from an open source project, and these are the source code files. And do you know C and C++? A bit. So this will correspond to includes. So if a file includes another, you have a link. But if you can do the same with subroutines and with classes, and you always observe the same pattern. So a simple self-organized process based on feedback, on duplication, reproduces something that is very well planned and that a lot of people is wasting a lot of time thinking of. So it's something to have in mind. The other self-organized pattern, is not at the level of code, but at the level of the social organization. And here, now we are trying to answer that question at the beginning, which was what is better, open or closed? So I think it's instructive to compare the community of people doing software, the social community, with animal communities like a wasp, the paper wasp. And in paper wasps, there is a hierarchy of dominance. So the wasps, they fight between them in order to get the right for reproduction. And there is just one queen that dominates the rest of the colony, and now all the colony contributes to the reproduction of that queen. So here, what we see in the paper wasp is that the hierarchy has appeared by using a very simple feedback mechanism, right? The strongest wasp is reinforced over the other wasps that contribute to the construction of the colony. And you can measure similar thing you can see a similar thing in the organization of open software. And here again, you can go to the internet and there is a rich database of all the connections, all the emails that have been exchanged among programmers. And this corresponds to the TCL community. And here you can see that a few persons, the core members, dominate the rest of the community in terms of the amount of emails exchanged, right? And this is technically is called the Rich Club organization. So another hierarchy has emerged in a different system, but here the enforcement is not local. It's not like in WASP, which was a very simple feedback mechanism. Here is much more complicated because obviously programmers are thinking and planning things. But in spite of being a more complex mechanism, a feedback, and I think that's the important part, has yield to the emergence of a hierarchy. Right? So in a way, it's also a self-organized process. Not to mention that these communities are not controlled. They are spontaneously formed in the internet. In principle, the people that comes to contribute, they don't get paid, they contribute freely. So it's interesting because these all communities, they claim they are open and more democratic, but in the end, what you observe is the emergence of a core of people that is centralizing the activity of the community. I don't have data because closed software is closed. It will be interesting to look at the organization of companies and to check the pattern of email exchanges to see how different this pattern is from the closed system. And then we will have an idea of how different are open and closed software.
But what would you expect? Something similar?
I will expect something similar. So my idea is that these two systems, they have different motives and motivations, but in the end somehow they self-organize in the same pattern. But I don't have the data, so I cannot make that claim. We only have the data from the open source. So, in order to finish my talk, now we have just reached the final part, which is evolution. And here we are somehow bringing together everything. And it's clear, and this has been a claim, that the combination of the communications of internet plus computation has given rise to something called the information revolution, information technological revolution. So the question is, can we predict what combinations of actual technologies will give rise to new disruptive novel technologies? We don't know, but people is trying to do some things in that regard. So for example, this is a map, it's a self-organized map trying to represent the landscape of technological innovations as recorded in a big corpus of texts. So here we can see there are different areas like video games, which the height means the importance. So here apparently sports is much more important than video games.
According to what?
According to this corpus of data, it's in the Wikipedia. So I don't know, mathematics is science, it's not very high as well. Well, I don't know. We should check this more carefully, right? So, can we build one of those maps in a more systematic way? What I'm proposing is not just to look at collections of texts, but to look at a very nice record of technological innovation that is also available in the internet, which is the patents. In particular, North American patents. They have a very rich database of more than 3 million patents. And And every patent describes an invention. And the interesting thing is that every patent comes with a list of references, citations. And those citations somehow, they trace the evolutionary history of invention. They tell you who influenced whom. So what we can do is to build a map of technology from these patents, and in particular from the citation information. So from that collection of patents, we can construct a network of citations, and every patent will be a node, and every citation will be a link, and we also annotate the time passed, which is important as well. And here I'm going to show you the patent, the whole patent for the year 1963, which is very interesting, and presumably it's a map of the interactions of innovations in that particular year. And there are several patterns and structural things that we can observe. One is that these maps are not trees, right? So for example, we have hubs, and also we have a lot of connections, and we interpret those as again, like in software, as a pattern of recombination, right? It's like evidence that some of the inventions are just combinations of previous things. Another tool that has been used in also biological studies is to analyze the structure, the modularity of these things. Because if you remember the previous picture, there are like clumps of nodes that seem to be more connected among them than with the rest. And we can use algorithms in order to uncover this structure. We can define this Q value, which is called modularity, which somehow measures the strength of modules in the system. And if you do this for the year 1963, you can map those modules, and if you inspect those, they tend to correspond to domains. So the structural features somehow capture the semantics of inventions. So for example, this cluster will correspond to electronics, and some other cluster will correspond to chemistry, and that, I think it's a very interesting thing to look in the future, because somehow these are the precursors for new emerging domains in technology. So perhaps we can use these techniques in order to predict what areas of knowledge will develop more in the close future. And I think that will be useful for policy making, and also to predict, forecast what areas require more investment or what areas are more promising. So in order to finish my talk, I would like to make a general statement. Have you seen this movie? Come on, man. This is a recent movie. The Road. Have you seen The Road? The Road is based on this book by Cormac McCarthy. It's one of the 5 greatest American writers right now. So I recommend that you watch the movie. So if you trace the history of science and technology, there is one trend, is that engineering technology has been always in the forefront. So first we make things to work, and then later we understand, we explain how these things work. And that happened, for example, with the steam engine, has happened with electricity, and has happened with many things. In the 20th century, we witnessed something different. It was the concept of applied science. And now industries and governments, they provide funding, so scientists can develop new technologies. And for example, we are now witnessing the emergence of a new field called synthetic biology, which has not a practical application today, but I'm sure we will have practical applications very soon. So I think it's now important not just to do applied science, but to really to understand how these things have developed and how we can control this process. Because to some extent, we don't control the process. We have a lot of agents doing research in different fields, but we don't have any idea of the global picture. I don't think that we know where we are facing, although we can have this discussion later in the questions. Why I'm telling you this? Because now we're at times of great danger, right? We are facing a serious climate crisis. We have the economic crisis. We have many things that if we don't do something, perhaps we will not end up very well in the future. So it's a challenge. But we have always defined ourselves by our ability to overcome the impossible. So perhaps it's time to do something, because I don't think we want to keep walking down this road. And the choice is ours. Thank you. So any questions?
Sorry, the first slide that you showed that the connections were being made, and you said that like you're turning on the valve randomly?
Randomly, yes, with probability P.
Yes.
So
okay. I have like a technical question. It's like it's the randomness question. What kind of like random generator? You know, like what kind of random generator the platform you're using is using, because most of them they don't use real random generators.
Ah, yes, yes.
Pseudo-random generators, and it's already been like proven in several different applications that when you use pseudo-random generators, the result can be a state of the machine, and the result can be predicted. So it's not really random. So
yes. So the question is, to what extent the outcome of or the onset of the percolation threshold depends on the implementation of the random generation?
Yes.
That's a very good question. I think that for experiments like that, I don't think that these pseudo random generators are giving you any artifact. These artifacts normally affect you when you have a very long simulation times, and then you can have, actually you have to make a test. You have to test what is the period of the pseudo-random regeneration before doing anything like this. Percolation thresholds are very simple to explain or to present, but they are very hard to demonstrate mathematically. So in this particular example, I think that it's proof that for a lattice, the percolation threshold is 1/2. But in general, we have to resort to computer simulations and to trust the accuracy of the machine, right? So, yeah, it's a good question, because it's a question of how relevant are your models in explaining the phenomena you are observing. So it's a good point.
Sergi, when you were talking about the small wall topology, I don't know, I had kind of different type of definition based more on the local and global efficiency.
Yeah.
And basically that if you have a small wall network,
yeah,
you have different hubs highly interconnected within the hub, but then you have kind of several links among the different hubs, so that you are you are more robust to insult. So if there is one of these links that fails, you still can have this communication. No, right? I mean, it's something like this.
Yeah.
But what you were saying here is a bit different, because you were showing just kind of one link, or meaning that some of these nodes were very important. If this node fails, I mean, communication is lost.
Well, I think that here are two different notions. One thing is how well connected the system is, and that's the small world property, which is technically is the average distance, the average path length. So if you take all the pairs, you compute the path, and then you compute the mean, and that gives you the average distance, and for a small network, a small world network, the average path length is very low. It's of the order of the logarithm of the system size. That's more about efficiency. And on the other side, you have robustness. And in Scalefree networks, what happens is that these networks, because of hubs, they are very robust to random attacks, meaning removal of nodes, but very fragile in terms of targeted attacks, meaning that you remove, for example, a hub. And that's more, it's not just a function, it's not just the performance, it's the percolation transition. So you disconnect the system. It's not only that the system performs worse, it's that the system doesn't perform at all. So these are two different notions, really. This is first to be connected, to ensure function, and then once you're connected, what you can do to have more efficiency in transport. So there's two different things. But yeah, I understand the confusion because the hubs in Scalefree networks are good both for efficient transmission and also to keep the system connected. So there's like a double, they play two roles, right?
And have you studied secondary pathways or kind of security links just in case one of these nodes, important nodes, because I mean in brain is quite a good example, but in cardiac tissue for kind of electrical propagation, you have as well the Purkinje network that you find structures like this, and you find kind of secondary pathways. Just I don't know, evolution has emerged this kind of pathways in case there are some problems with some nodes.
Yeah, the redundancy will be good in order to ensure a functioning system, but you have to take into account the cost. So there is a trade-off here. So you can add links, provided you have enough resources to keep these links working. Here, these links consume energy because they are electrical wires. So you have a trade-off here. So actually, in many systems, what you observe is a trade-off between these two things. And actually, the termite nest was a kind of an example of that. I was trying to have a system that is well connected, but having the least minimal number of galleries. So it's kind of a general principle, both in nature and man-made artifacts.
I have a couple of questions. One is probably very naive. Is the power distribution specific on Scalefree networks, or we can find it?
It's very broad. It's almost everywhere. And then that's, in the beginning, 15 years ago, was very controversial because for 60 years, we only have a few models. The random graph, I haven't explained more things about the random graph, but the random graph. And then in the 1989, we founded this power law thing, and now it's everywhere. The power law just means that there are feedback effects, amplification effects. And actually there are a number of mechanisms producing this pattern. I will say that if you want to analyze a system, you just go beyond these simple measures and try to analyze the sort of things I was presenting at the very end, the modularity, the correlations, and that's I think where the details are, where the information really is.
Mm-hmm.
So.
And then you said something about propagation information. What do you mean? How do you model information in your context?
Well, it depends on the system, but a very simple process is just spreading like this. So you can simulate propagation by just having nodes with different states. And one state can be propagating, and the other is just not propagating. Don't just by a simple contagion process, you can simulate everything like rumor spreading, epidemics.
Kind of cellular automata.
Or yeah, that will be one thing. Now, many techniques you can use. Basically, the idea is to have states, to model the states, have nodes with the states. The states, it depends on your system.
Do you consider selection bias in the analysis, especially in the last part?
Sorry?
In the patent study. So you are making the identification that the patent means a progress in science, but that might not be the case. So many US patents, you look at them and see.
That's a very, very good point. So the question is, if we do measure the fitness,
no, if you
or
measure
the value, somehow, no?
the limitation of your observed data, that you are maybe not measuring what you want, but some part of it, there is a selection bias.
Okay, now I understand. No, because I'm using the whole thing. So I'm using all the data that is published. If there is any bias, is the bias that is in the database, but I'm not selecting, I'm not pre-selecting information at the moment. I have been analyzing parts of it. So on Monday, actually if you are interested, I'm going to give another talk just on patent networks. I can give you the details. I will talk more about the analysis of these things. But in general, we have been using the whole data set. So we haven't.
You're assuming that the whole science.
No, the whole patent thing is the invention process is here, not the science. That's the patents. We don't take into account papers. It will be very interesting to complement this data set with papers, for example, because if you look at patents, sometimes they have references to scientific papers, and perhaps that's a source of bias, because it's using an external source of information. But in this study, we were concerned just to patents, and we were using all the data that was available. If there is any data missing, we don't know in principle. In principle, well, obviously not all the inventions are here, because here you only have inventions that have been patented. They have gone through a process of patent, right, to make the patent, which is costly and requires resources. But still, I think that this captures a lot of information. It's a multi-million data set, and it spans decades. It's a very rich, and also it has been curated, because sometimes the attorney, the guy that is, processing this information, is an expert that adds missing references, things that the inventor hasn't considered. So apparently it's a good deal of thinking into producing these structures, so I think it's quite safe. I think it's the best we have now. So of course there are limitations. So for example, I have been doing things I haven't presented here. I have been doing some analysis of the geography of how inventors are distributed in space, and the references sometimes are missing, the addresses are not exactly right. But in terms of citations, I would say it's quite solid. I don't know.
Last question, because we are out of time.
Okay. Now, so this is from 63, no? I understand.
Yeah.
So I guess you also did it for more recent.
Yeah, up to 2011, I think.
And is there any change in the way patents are presented? Like, do they cite more? No.
There is a very interesting thing. Is the growth of patents is super exponential. And actually, it diverges in 2023. So I guess at that point, we will collapse, the system will collapse. So,
but the number of citations to the domain, so like the free citations?
It grows, but linearly. What grows like crazy is the total number of applications. That is completely crazy, man. It's like skyrocketing. So that's something that remains to be explained. Why do we observe this hyperbolic growth in the number of dimensions? That's something that...
If you look at the users, does this also grow, or is this also the number of inventors?
The number of inventors is more or less proportional to the number of patents. Normally, the average number of inventors is in between 1 and 4. Sometimes you have teams, but normally you have 1 or 2 inventors. So I would say the number of inventors is proportional to the number of patents.
A few people in market.
No, here is more like a distributed thing, yeah. Yeah, it would be interesting to complement this with the European data set, which is something I haven't done, but it'd be very nice.
Thank you again.